Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I step off the train and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listeners. It's a lovely day here in suburban Chicago. The sun is out, the breeze is blowing. The temperature has got to be into the high 60s or low 70s, maybe even high 70s. It is a glorious day. It feels like summer, but it's only April 11th. Well, with that kind of temperature, I'm happy to be at the point where I can talk to you about board games on my way home from the train. So today we'll be talking about, in particular, I thought I would talk a little bit about Praga Caput Regni. Now, Praga Caput Regni is a game I have played several times online and twice on the table. I played it once on the table when I first purchased it by myself. I set up 2 players, just played them both. And then I played again recently with my daughter. We went through the game, figured out the scoring, I taught her the game, we played it. I had a great time, and I feel like I understand the game in a way that I did not before. So I'm really excited to play it again a few more times online, maybe one more time on the table to try to really solidify a sense of how the game works, how it scores, and what you're supposed to be doing. But while I was playing that, I got to thinking about a phrase that appears in the rulebook. So when you are reading the rulebook to Praga Caput Regni, which is a Vladimir Suchý game from a couple years ago, published by Delicious Games, when you're reading the rulebook, it says King so-and-so, I can't remember the king, Charles somebody maybe, is constructing the city of Prague and wants you to help. You are a noble person working on helping make glorious the city of Prague to win favor with the king. In the game's iconography, the points that you earn are, you guessed it, little crowns. Maybe you didn't guess it, but they're little crowns. And the idea is you're winning favor with the king. So that by the end of the game, the person who's won the most favor with the king is the winner. As I was reading that, I got to thinking about the idea of like winning the favor of the ruler is a surprisingly common motivation for points in Euro board games. It's not quite as common as the phrase, if there's still a tie, the tied players share the victory, or yeah, that's probably or place the board in the center of the table. Those are both more common, but it is pretty common. Just off the top of my head, I believe that, and I'd love for people to head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269. Enjoyed the conversation about this episode if you have corrections, but I think that here are, off the top of my head, 5 games in addition to Praga Caput Regni where winning the favor of the royal person is the goal of the game. We have another Vladimir Suchý game, Messina 1347. We've got Lorenzo Il Magnifico and its sibling game, the Grand Austria Hotel, which was not on my list here. In both of those, I believe you're trying to win the favor of the current ruler. I know that Lorenzo Il Magnifico, if you aren't contributing enough to the church, you can get yourself in trouble. There is a king track in Grand Austria Hotel. If you aren't doing enough there, then you get in trouble. We also have Orleans. You are trying to build up your reputation, which kind of sounds like favor of the king. It might be a little different, but close enough for government work. And then, of course, there's also the role of the patrician in Roman society, particularly Glory to Rome and Forum Trajanum. In both of those games, you are trying to build up the city of Rome after the destruction of it or something. I mean, you could even say Foundations of Rome probably fits that narrative as well. In all these cases, what you're trying to do is generate reputation or points based on how well you do the tasks of the game, most of which involved building or coordinating the use of resources and workers. One reviewer that I know who particularly likes this kind of game has called out this particular practice, and that's Richard Ham, or Rado. He says he always really enjoys a game where you play a middle manager, often in medieval Europe, moving resources around and trying to be efficient. A middle management efficiency puzzle, he calls them. And it got me thinking a little bit, why is this theme so common? What is it about this particular theme that is interesting to game players and to designers particularly? So I came up with a couple thoughts about it, and I'll pontificate on these a little bit and then think a little further. So in particular, if you're hearing that clicking, somebody's doing some painting. And so what we're hearing is a ladder being adjusted for somebody getting ready to climb up a house. So what it strikes me is that in all of these cases, you are part of the bourgeoisie, right? Like the upper middle class business merchant class. You're not the ultra wealthy nobility. You're not workers. You are this sort of middle class, business class folks. So what is it about that particular echelon of society that makes for interesting board games, or has traditionally made for interesting board games? First, I'd suggest that in capitalist society, it's the middle managers who have a mix of active work to do, but also organizational agency. In other words, if you are a business owner or you are an upper middle class citizen in one of these situations, you aren't so wealthy that you don't have to do anything, or maybe you're driven by noblesse oblige to help, right? In the case of Messina 1347, you're trying to gain reputation by helping the people in the village. But at the same time, you also have the capital and the power to do the organizing, not to be the ones being organized, right? And I don't mean organizing here in the union sense. I mean, you're the person telling other people what to do. And as we think about the common idea of success in capitalist culture, while there is the fantasy of unbelievable wealth, of leisure-giving wealth, of money so expansive that one need not do anything anymore, the reality is that most of the time we are happy with, or are settled with, or we think of success as making it into the bourgeoisie or remaining in the bourgeoisie if you are born into that class. And of course, we have seen a stratification of that in particular as the middle class wears away, that sort of low-end wealthy is the goal, because the other option is barely scraping by. And so I wonder if the aspirational nature of the bourgeoisie as an activity or a goal for members of capitalist cultures is part of the reason that we see enjoyment in the enacting of those cultures, right? That you have the wherewithal to organize, govern, and you have agency. It reinforces the notion of upward mobility, that if you do better than the other people, then you gain the king's favor, and presumably you gain material benefit from that. But as I said, you're beholden in some ways to the really wealthy people, the king, right? But you're also more capable and more flexible than the working class, who generally don't get, especially in medieval era, don't get much agency at all about what they're going to do, right? That they are often serfs, so they are tied to the land directly, or even in more volatile times where the workers had a bit more agency over, say, their labor. They're still dependent on those larger structures for security and safety, and they have to trade their daily labor for those things. So, a game where you are a farmer, if you have to spend a lot of your time trying to farm and give your tithe to the leader, I don't know, maybe actually there are games that do that too. But then you're like a land worker. Interesting. But I think generally games where you're playing a middle manager buy into this particular view, this particular fantasy of capitalism. And I do want to highlight here, when I say fantasy or myth of capitalism, I'm not suggesting that's entirely unreal, but I certainly am suggesting that its prominence as the story of capitalism maybe outweighs the reality of it as an available experience for most people. Particularly like using America as an example, the current American economy and the division of wealth and labor suggests that upward mobility is less and less available to most people as the middle class gets smaller and smaller. That really wasn't the point of my going into this today. It was more to think about what is it about being a middle manager that's so fun as a fantasy. But to sort of wrap this up a little bit, it did get me thinking about what are some games that engage with other economic models where we're not just part of the sort of capitalist mode. On one hand, you have the ultra wealthy, right? The idea of like being a king or being a robber baron of the highest order. And there too, you are in conflict with the other players with the notion of trying to gain more power or to develop more power. But it got me thinking like, sort of three other prominent economic models, socialism, libertarianism, and communism. I'd be interested to see how those emerge in games, so I thought about it a little bit. I'd be really interested to hear from people who've studied these maybe in more detail than I have, what you think of this suggestion and what would be better examples. So I started to start with socialism, and generally here I'm seeing socialism as a kind of, as it exists in like parts of Europe where socialism is the moderated capitalism, that you have a broad mandate for a cultural safety net, and you still leave in place some of the elements that allow people to, say, gain some measure of individual wealth. So there would be some availability for individual achievement, some motivation for individual excellence, but a shared sense of community and sense of obligation that demands a robust social safety net and shared resources, and a philosophy of shared resources at its heart. I was thinking two games in particular. I was thinking about games that have semi-co-op elements. In particular, the Martin Wallace game Australia. In this one, you are colonists settling the desiccated and destroyed continent of Australia, where the Cthulhu, the ancient ones of the Cthulhu mythos have settled. And as a group, you have to work on both settling the continent, but also wiping out the elder gods. And if you fail to do so, then everybody loses. That the group is obligated to work with one another to ensure that everybody is at least doing better at the end of the game than the elder gods. If the elder gods have passed anybody, everyone loses. At the same time, the game does allow for individual efficiency and acceleration of points on the individual level. So individuals can come out ahead, but if they neglect the social network or the social obligation, then they lose. So that to me feels like what sort of contemporary socialism is, if you're not going full on all shared resources, all communal ownership, which is probably more true socialism, but I think is less common. I also thought about Dead of Winter this way, but Dead of Winter feels like, because there's a trader element, Dead of Winter feels slightly different than that. As I thought about libertarianism, the two examples I thought of, the negative example would be Monopoly, right? Monopoly has almost no social safety net. In fact, the game is built on the idea that individual excellence would succeed. It also has the element that I think is really interesting. Libertarians often attribute all success to hard work and individual fortitude, when in fact luck plays a huge part in helping anybody succeed, whether it's luck of birth or luck of happenstance. And so the fact that part of how you win at Monopoly is you get lucky with your dice rolls, I think there's an interesting corollary there. On the plus side, I think you could maybe argue that Agricola is a libertarian game in its ideals as well, in that you have, there are central resources that everybody's fighting over, and then you take them and you block them off into individual resources, and those individual resources then become the tool by which we measure your success. Now, the game doesn't really have any setbacks. There's no plagues. There's no situation in which you would have to rely on one another. It's strictly about individual success. And I think it might be something there to say that Agricola is a libertarian ideal. And finally, I was thinking about communism particularly. And, I was thinking pure co-op games are probably the place you go. If you look at Pandemic, for instance, there is no worry about individual needs in that game. All shared needs are taken care of. Each person gets the things they need to succeed and gives what they can to the success of the group. Of course, in pandemic, the option for individual expression or individual success is not really there. All you can do is try to help the group succeed. And in fact, the sublimation of the needs of the individual to the needs of the many is a key part of the game. Often you'll let a city outbreak, or in the Pandemic Legacy game, you might let a city sink into terror for the greater good. And that feels like it's part of the core notion of communism as well. Of course, this leaves out all the terrible condemnations and compelling individual experiences that people had in communist countries, which one could probably attribute more to corruption and a misapplication of the communist ideals than communism itself. But that's maybe a question for people better versed in the political history than I am. Well, I'd be keen to hear what you think of these ideas. What are there games that you thought of that seem to fit these models? Are there motivations that I did not discuss that you think we should discuss? Head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and share your thoughts on those issues, and I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.